San Juan Capistrano, California, an organization dedicated to the biblical principle, to each man an answer. Today's program, The Kingdom of the Occult, Part 1. Now, here's your host, Dr. Walter Martin.
Thank you, and welcome to today's program, The Kingdom of the Occult, Part 1. We'll be devoting this entire program to the subject of witchcraft, including its origins and where it's at today. Along the way, we'll be providing you with a thoroughly documented history of American witchcraft dating back to the early 1600s, a time period which was a very difficult one in American history. While preparing the material for this program, our staff visited Salem, Massachusetts, where much of the demonic activity of witchcraft started on the American continent. We'll take you to the exact location where it most probably started, and we'll be dispelling some of the rumors and myths that have been a part of our folklore over the years regarding this provocative subject. When we visited Salem, we talked with a local Christian pastor who offered some very interesting insights into what's happening there today. And we'll bring you that interview later in this program. Then we'll be talking also to two people, Mary Harold and Mike Warnicke, both of whom were formerly witches and who are now Christians. They'll describe some of the rituals they were involved in, as well as giving a clear warning as to why Christians should never become involved in witchcraft. First, however, before we begin, a definition of terms is in order. What is occultism? It's a common Latin word referring to the hidden or the secret, mysterious things which are always forbidden by God. It always involves some form of religion and has something to do with the supernatural in whatever context you find it. The kingdom of the occult is built on one word, experience. It's not built on revealed authority, such as we rely on through our relationship with God as revealed in His Word, the Bible. Witchcraft is directly connected to occultic practices and is an abomination to God by His own proclamation. But what exactly is a witch? A witch is a male or a female who uses occultic powers for supposedly good or evil ends. Hence we have the designation, which many of you may have heard, the white witch and the black witch. I say a witch is using evil powers regardless of color, and there's no such thing biblically as a distinction between a black or a white witch. For now, however, let us simply say that a witch is a medium, as the Bible defines the term. A medium who uses occultic phenomena to bring about what they call good or evil. Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan, has spent a good deal of his time, as you might imagine, researching witchcraft both in the United States and Europe. LaVey has pointed out, and I believe quite correctly, that there is no such thing as a white witch. That is pure mythology. He believes, and I agree with him, that all witches are drawing on occultic power which does not originate with God. This is a very excellent observation, which we should keep in mind as we analyze this subject on the program. Now, the Bible is very clear on this fact, that God is the source of the power of goodness, and Satan the source of the power of evil. This simply means that if you are not drawing your power from the Lord, it is obvious that you are getting your power from another source, and that source must be satanic. Now, some people call this power source by different names. For example, Anton LaVey does not believe in a personal devil, as we understand him to exist from accounts found in the Bible. Some people call this source of energy by different names, elemental force, magic, or control over the elements. But it's clear that this power is drawn from a source other than God. The real acid test here is that we are admonished to put this evil away from our midst. Apparently, the Holy Spirit felt strongly enough to expand on this point, so there is additional counsel for Christians. The Bible says, beginning in verse 5, "And that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he hath spoken to turn you away from the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of bondage." Witches are all around us today, not only in Bible times, but in the contemporary world. There are literally thousands of covens all over the United States, as well as untold thousands of practicing witches in England and different locations throughout Europe. Witchcraft has pagan origins, rituals, and worship. Many witches prefer to call these ancient occultic practices Wicca, which is the old English word that the term witch is derived from. Wicca is defined as wise one, or back to nature. The initials are also used for a witchcraft newsletter called the Witches International Craft Association. There are all kinds of varieties of witches and or pagans. Many of them say that they acknowledge the supremacy of the feminine deity, the goddess who is called sometimes Diana or Aphrodite, and that they practice magic. Many witches claim that they don't even believe Satan exists, much less worship him. In fact, some witches or pagans go to great lengths to disassociate themselves from Satan worshippers. Ultimately, that is who they are worshiping, but they have been deluded by Satan into believing something very different. To learn more about the origins of witchcraft in America, some members of our staff traveled to Salem, Massachusetts, near Boston, to get the real story. This analysis begins with our reporter, Regina Sipple, speaking from the home site of the Reverend Samuel Parris, where witchcraft supposedly began on the American continent. Watch.
This is what's left of the home of Samuel Parris. He was formerly a merchant in the West Indies. He came to Salem in November of 1689. It was here that he changed occupations and became a minister of the gospel. He brought with him 3 slaves from the West Indies, including John Indian and his wife Tituba. It was said she was very proficient in the art of black magic. It was here that a group of girls met every evening to practice magic. They began to believe these things, and subsequently they alarmed the town. They began to have fits and convulsions, and at that point, the doctor said that they were bewitched. The girls blamed innocent people for making them that way, allegedly people they didn't like, or so goes the story. First blamed were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba herself, the woman who started it all. Because of what started here in this place, witchcraft began on the American continent, and between March 1st and September 21st of 1692, 10 people were convicted and executed as witches. The gallows worked overtime. On September 22nd, 8 more convicted witches were executed. We came here to Danvers, Massachusetts, formerly known as Old Salem Village, to examine the evidence that exists on witchcraft from 300 years ago to today, from both a theological and historical perspective. To obtain a historical perspective on witchcraft, we talked with Richard Trask, who is the archivist of the Peabody Institute. What led up to the terrible tragedies that occurred in 1692?
That's a hard question to really answer very briefly, primarily because a lot of people still aren't sure what brought about the witchcraft hysteria. As a matter of fact, after the hysteria was over, beginning really in 1692, people started writing about it. And since that time, there have been over probably 250 major works on the subject of people trying to interpret what happened and why it did happen. I think one of the important factors that brought about this witchcraft frenzy in late 17th century Massachusetts were external factors which affected the Salem Village population. This was a period of civil unrest. This was a period when Massachusetts had had its charter revoked, the charter which allowed people who lived in Salem Village and other parts of Massachusetts to own their own property. So they weren't sure if they were going to actually own the property that they had farmed for many generations. You always had problems with Indians and the French, and in 1692 you had the beginning of another Indian war very close to home for the Salem Village inhabitants. You had ministers continuously preaching that the Puritans had been backsliding. They weren't as religious as they had been in previous generations, and therefore God was going to rebuke them. So there are a number of external factors in the colony which brought about certain unrest in Salem Village. The village itself was kind of unusual in that it was almost in a political vacuum. They belonged theoretically to Salem Town, although the villagers didn't want to be part of Salem Town. Salem Town was much more of an urbanized area where mercantile development was taking place, and the village was agricultural and separated by 5 to 10 miles and a whole different concept of life. And the people who lived in the village had constant problems with their ministers. One minister had been forced to resign. Two others had left that it was almost in a political vacuum. They belonged theoretically to Salem town, although the villagers didn't want to be part of Salem town. Salem town was much more of an urbanized area where mercantile development was taking place, and the village was agricultural and separated by 5 to 10 miles and a whole different concept of life. And the people who lived in the village had constant problems with their ministers. One minister had been forced to resign. Two others had left very unhappy, and you had constant bickering within the community itself. So all these factors, plus a number of others, I think were underlying factors which helped bring about something like this, which would germinate into a real hysteria.
Who was Tituba, who was said to be very prominent in the area of black magic?
Okay, Tituba was a Carib Indian who was owned by Reverend Samuel Parris. And the Reverend Mr. Parris, before he had become a minister, was a merchant who had lived in the West Indies. And he had picked up 3 slaves, Tituba, a John Indian, and another smaller Indian child. And he apparently wasn't terribly successful as being a merchant. He eventually ended up back in Boston. He decided to become a minister, and Salem Village eventually asked him to come out and be minister for their congregation. And he brought with him Tituba, and we don't really know too much about her. As a matter of fact, if it weren't for the witchcraft hysteria, she would have kind of fallen in the cracks of history, because slaves and people lower economic status just usually aren't recorded in history. Whether or not Tituba knew black arts, we're not sure. The witchcraft began in the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris in the winter of 1691-92, and Tituba, according to local tradition, began telling the girls stories of witchcraft and things of that type. But the very interesting thing about the beginning of the witchcraft is that witchcraft was not the voodoo kind of witchcraft that we normally associate with the West Indies. It was a real English European type of witchcraft. So exactly how it started and who brought it about, we're not absolutely sure, because the record's just a kind of silent on it. But it is quite valid to say that Tituba did have at least something to do with the beginning of the hysteria.
Were a number of innocent people hurt by this?
Well, yes. During the witchcraft hysteria that lasted beginning in very late February of 1692 until really into the next year, early 1693, during that period of time, something like 200 persons were actually accused of practicing witches, and a number of them were brought to a preliminary hearing and then finally trial. And of that number, 19 were hanged, 1 was pressed to death, and at least 3 died in jail. So it had a dramatic effect upon Massachusetts, primarily Essex County, Massachusetts. And when you consider that 250 people accused in a relatively small population meant that it was a major crisis within the colony at that time.
Do you believe this is an example of mass hysteria, or was there more to it?
About 15 years ago, a professor from Pennsylvania by the name of Chadwick Hansen wrote a book called Witchcraft at Salem. And the book was very good in giving a fairly specific account of mass hysteria and how that could have been part of the reason why the witchcraft occurred in Salem Village. And part of his concept was the fact that because of all these external pressures and so forth, and because of what was happening locally, that the girls began to be mass hysterics, and that they started exhibiting very unusual behavior, much more than kids simply play acting, which psychosomatically they had display itself on their bodies and on what was happening in the courts. And because of this, a lot of the male population and female population, the adults, realized that the kids weren't play acting, and this just brought about a tumbling action of more accusations going increasingly all the time. And that because of all of the external circumstances in the village, it was ripe for this kind of hysteria. And he postulates that this mass hysteria did take place, in fact, in the village.
Do you believe the witchcraft is real?
Well, it depends upon what you mean by real. If we say that we have a population that primarily believes in witchcraft, a few people perhaps doubt it, which we know in 1692 is the case, but the majority of the people tend to believe in real witchcraft. And if I, as a member of that population, believe that either because I'm mentally deranged or have delusions of grandeur or simply want to have one up on everybody else, if I believe I can do certain things to either hurt or help you, and if I then say you're getting a bad headache, and if you know that it's a given that I'm kind of an unusual person and that a lot has been talked about concerning me before, there is a possibility that you're going to get a headache. And under that circumstance, yeah, you can have a real witchcraft occurring, but the reality isn't on the outside, it's on the inside of how your brain works. And in that way, yes, I do think that there was some witchcraft practiced in 1692. There's an awful lot of evidence, circumstantial as well as primary source material, which indicates that people practiced white magic and in some cases even black magic. And that the witches, or those persons accused of being witches, at least a few of them might have actually believed that they themselves were witches.
How about today?
Well, I don't know that much about witchcraft today. Most of those practitioners of witchcraft today would say that they don't have much to do with the black arts, with devil worship, that they're more interested in that pre-15th century witchcraft, white witchcraft, in which they are trying to, by means of understanding the universe, herbs, how they themselves function in the universe, that they're able to attain power and to be an influence on what happens around them. And you have a lot of so-called white witches roaming around. Sybil Leek, who died a few years ago, I think, was a practitioner of white witchcraft. In Salem, there's a woman named Laurie Cabot, who is a white witch. They will usually tell you they have nothing to do with a diabolical witchcraft. There are, however, certain individuals who are devil worshippers today, who practice a type of witchcraft that relates to belief in the devil and actual literal worship of the devil.
How long did this period of history last?
Very short time in the study of history, about 8 months.
How did it end?
That's not as easy a question to answer. A lot of factors brought about the ending. One was, after 8 months, people began to get tired of what was happening. Some people who were accused, instead of simply bowing to authority and taking their lumps, tended to start proceedings of defamation of character on the afflicted children and their parents. And the parents were fearful that it might directly affect their pocketbook, their estate. Probably the most important factor which brought about the end of the witchcraft was the fact that ministers and magistrates from the Boston area began asking for advice from others elsewhere, and they had sought the opinion of some New York ministers who indicated that yes, the girls did seem to be actual afflicted people, but you shouldn't take them at their face value, because since they were under this affliction, they might not know the difference between right or wrong and truth and non-truth. And so they urged that the use of spectral evidence not be used within the court for good, viable testimony. and when spectral evidence was no longer allowed, they just didn't have enough to try the people for practicing witchcraft, who were both church members and persons of property. Instead, any freeman could be a juror. And there was also talk at the time that the girls were beginning to accuse more and more important people, and that this kind of brought about a disinterest by the higher authorities in pursuing the matter. But it just did seem to stop. And the governor, the new governor who came from England in 1692, Sir William Phipps, issued a general jail delivery which said that those persons still in jail, if they paid their fees, in those days, if you were in jail, you had to pay for the chains that were put on you as well as the food that you ate. Once the fees were paid, the people could go free. And after that, most of the people did go free, with the exception of at least one woman who couldn't pay her fees and died in jail.
What happened to some of the people that were set free?
Well, since there were, 200 plus people who were accused, and since many of those who were accused tended to be from the lower social strata, we lose a lot of them in history. We don't know what happens to them. Tituba, for example, we know she was in jail. Reverend Parris didn't want her back, and we're told traditionally that for her jail fees, somebody else bought her, and she goes into the obscurity of history, and we never hear of her again. Some of the other individuals move out of town. Sarah Cloyce, the other sister of Rebecca Nurse, moves to Framingham with her husband. A lot of people were very much affected by the hysteria afterwards. There was a little girl somewhere around the age of 3 or 4 years old who was accused of practicing witchcraft. Her mother died as a result of the witchcraft, and her name Dorsey Good. We're told that once she was released from incarceration of something like 8 months in jail, that she was mentally unbalanced for the rest of her life. So jail did have a very somber effect on a lot of the people who had been thrown into there for many months on end. And beginning in 1703 and culminating in 1711, a lot of the more well-to-do families, or at least the more cohesive families, began petitioning the general court for redress of grievances, for some kind of financial remuneration for those who had been killed by the state. And at least a few of those persons were given monetary recompense.
What can you show us here that deals with witchcraft in the past?
Well, we collect here things having to do with witchcraft that are on paper. And I have a few manuscript volumes that pertain to the witchcraft hysteria, as well as some of the very early imprints about the witchcraft. And we also have a few artifacts that we excavated from the Reverend Samuel Parris' house where the witchcraft hysteria began.
Can you show us some of these artifacts?
Sure, why don't you come on in. Well, we're now in the non-public section of the archives, and this is our vault where we keep the most important records and some of the very rare books. And let me get a couple for you.
Can I hold something?
Sure, why don't you hold on to that. What I've got is 2 examples of some of the imprints that we have concerning the witchcraft, and this little volume here is one of the rarest of the books about the witchcraft, and it's called A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, and it was written in 1697 by Reverend John Hale. He was one of the ministers in the local area, and it was his explanation of what actually happened during the witchcraft hysteria. And he was a very cautious man, because although he wrote it in 1697, he made sure that the book wouldn't be published until after he died, because he was afraid he was going to ruffle a few feathers on what he said. When you read it today, however, it sounds like a very modest approach to the witchcraft. And what he says basically is that the reasons things went wrong in Salem during the trials was the fact that mistaken principles had been used in discovering who were witches. And he said you should go back to the scriptures to understand who witches were and not use English precedents.
There are only 4 copies of this book. Could you tell us just a little bit more about what it says?
Well, Hale was minister at Beverly, and he was one of those ministers locally who got caught up in the witchcraft. The local ministers tended to be much more caught up in what was happening than those ministers in the Boston area. As a matter of fact, contrary to, I think, popular belief, ministers like Increase Mather and Cotton Mather, the famous Boston family, weren't real witch finders. If anything, they were trying to tell the civil authorities to try not to go so fast. Increase Mather at one point said, it's better to let 10 possible witches go free than to execute one person for practicing witch who was innocent. And Hale, once he got back to a little form of reality, wanted to try to find out what had actually happened. And this was his very hot, rendering examination of what did happen so that others wouldn't fall into the trap that he had fallen into during the witchcraft hysteria.
What was the biblical approach to this book?
Well, what he did was he took a look at scriptures and how scriptures identified who witches were and how to know them. And what Hale said was during the witchcraft hysteria, Old English precedences had been used to discover witches. One means was the use of trying to find devil marks. And a devil mark was, according to English tradition, a mark that the devil gave a witch, that the witch had an imp or a familiar that usually was unseen. Sometimes it could be seen. It was often in the form of a yellow bird or a black cat or something like that. And this little familiar, which did all sorts of devilment for the witch, had to suck the lifeblood out of the witch in order to get energy. So this witch tit or witch mark was always on one of the witches. And according to English precedents, all you had to do was examine a person's body, and if you found a mark that looked like it might be a devil's mark, you would take a common pin, stick it. If the person bled, cried out, it was natural. If they didn't bleed, didn't cry out, didn't have any sensation, chances are it was a devil's mark. Unfortunately, many moles and things like that on a body don't have nerve endings on them, so you can stick it all you want and it won't have any reaction. So Hale said this kind of evidence was not valid and therefore should be gotten rid of.
What is your opinion of Hale's biblical approach to this subject?
I don't really believe in literal witchcraft, so my idea of his showing it in scriptures is that it's all wet. What I do think is that Hale was a very good man who was trying to find out what had happened according to the way he thought things out. And by his trying to reason what had brought about the witchcraft, he was doing something that most of the other people contemporary to him hadn't done. And what he was trying to do was a very good thing. I think what he did was not necessarily very valid, but he thought it was.
We're here in Peabody, Massachusetts, a few miles from where the witchcraft trials took place, and a few miles also from the new Salem, Massachusetts. We're here with Pastor Michael McCumbee of the Tabernacle Baptist Church. Pastor McCumbee, could you tell us a little bit about witchcraft in this area?
I believe as a pastor, I believe that the Word of God teaches that witchcraft is an abomination unto God, but the area in which we live here is very much an occult witchcraft haven. There is the official logo and emblem for Salem, Massachusetts itself is a witch and has always been known as the Witch City. To an outsider, this is very much a tourist attraction and a drawing card. There's in the city of Salem the Witch House, the Witch Museum, the Witch Dungeon, and of course there's an official city witch by the name of Lori Cabot, who has her own witch shop, which she claims, of course, to be a white witch, but of course we believe that the only witch mentioned in the Word of God is something that's really not taken that serious. So I believe as a pastor that there's just there's an eeriness, there's an air of knowing that there's an evil spirit, particularly I believe the closer that you get to Salem itself. Not that we want to draw a lot of people here as tourists to find out for themselves, but I believe that it is very much an hysteria that is still here.
Have you had any personal experiences or ever met any witches, say, on a witnessing venture?
Well, as a church, we believe in door-to-door visitation, and being that Salem is within 2 miles of our front door of our church, we believe that we have a responsibility to reach the city of Salem as well as we do our own city of Peabody. On several occasions, we have knocked doors in Salem, and there, on one occasion, about, I would say 5 years ago, I was out knocking a door myself on my own, and I wouldn't encourage too many people probably to go out by themselves. But on one occasion, I knocked the door of a first-floor apartment, of a 3-apartment building, where a woman came to the door dressed in black, and she came with her daughter. The daughter came to the door with her, probably a girl around 8 to 10 years old. Both the lady and her daughter were dressed in black, and black eyeshadow, eye makeup, and I felt like right away that there was not only could I tell by her appearance, but by the eerie feeling that I received, that there was something that was an unholy spirit that did not agree with the Holy Spirit that was in me. I began to witness to her, handed her a gospel tract, and right away she began to comment on the fact that she did not believe in Bible religion, and she did not believe in being born again, and she was a practicing white witch. Well, I opened up some scriptures in the Old Testament, and I began to deal with her briefly, because there wasn't, she didn't allow me a whole lot of time to comment. I may have gotten out 1 or 2 verses on the fact that witchcraft is an abomination unto God, whereupon she proceeded to say that she did not believe that and slammed the door. I began to walk up the steps to the 2nd floor door to knock it. When about halfway up the first landing, I knew that there was something mysterious in the house. I could feel the feeling even out in the hallway, and right away my legs both felt like they had 10-pound weights attached to each one, and I could not climb the steps any further. So I stopped, and I bowed my head, and I said, Lord Jesus, by the precious blood of the Lord Jesus Christ, I command this evil spirit to leave. And as quickly as that happened, it left, and I proceeded on my way, knowing that I had met a demon-possessed woman that was dealing, as she had said, in white witchcraft, but I knew very well that it wasn't white witchcraft.
All that you have seen and heard on this report is true. And again, it should be emphasized that it started right here with the slave girl Tituba, who enchanted young girls with tales of black magic. It began simply with these girls trying to get some excitement in their lives, but ultimately it turned into something much more serious than that.
Thank you, Regina, for that most interesting report, which shows what can happen when people get carried away dabbling in the occult. This is modern-day Salem, a community made famous around the world as being associated with the beginnings of American witchcraft. Today, most people in Salem treat this subject lightly, and in many cases use it to promote tourism. There are many witches' museums and other historical sites which many people pay good money to see. When tourists visit these places, they are asked to consider purchasing a variety of witchcraft trinkets, including dolls and other artifacts as souvenirs. Every October, just before Halloween, which is a sacred and important holiday for all witches, as we'll see later on, there is held the Witches' Ball. During this time of year, some people like to let their hair down, and there are lots of parties, which in itself is not all bad. However, what most of these people don't realize is that the forces of evil, demons, the witches, and other purveyors of the occult are all around them. Despite this, most of these people take it all in a jovial sort of way. We talked with one lady who was attending the Witches' Ball at the time, and she told us that she was having so much fun that she'd like to be a witch.
Tell us about your getup. Were you inspired? Salem is witches, so I decided to be a witch.
Today, there are over 26,000 witches and witches' covens in the United States alone, including many so-called independents who study and practice witchcraft by themselves and who have never been part of a coven. We talked to an ex-witch, Mary Harold, who practiced alone, and she had this to say about how she got involved in the occult.
At the age of 13, I asked Satan to have sexual intercourse with me. Now, you have to understand that was not an overnight decision or an act of impulse. I had premeditated the moment for many months, ever since discovering a book in my stepfather's library that dealt explicitly and graphically with sexual witchcraft in one of its chapters. But the book did not mark the beginning of my interest in occultism. It only served to harvest seeds that had already been planted in my early childhood. As a little girl, I was entertained and fascinated by the material in occult comic books, movies, television shows, cartoons, magazines. For example, I remember one episode of Alcoa Presents that dealt with the subject of extrasensory perception. It really enthralled me. It impressed me. And the Twilight Zone used to present stories about witchcraft. Those messages enticed me, challenging my sense of reality, stimulating my imagination, and certainly stirring my curiosity. They also caused me to seriously question my participation in and the validity of Christianity. By the time I was 13, I was completely disillusioned and embittered with Christianity and everything it represented. It's important for you to understand, however, that the disillusionment, the embittered feelings I was experiencing came as a result of not really knowing Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. You see, I knew about George Washington. I'd read about him in history books. I knew how he performed in the White House, but I never met him personally. The same is true of my experience with Christianity. I knew Bible stories. I had read about the resurrection, the crucifixion hundreds of times. I was raised in what you might consider a traditional Christian home. But I did not know Jesus personally in my heart. I was not born again.
What are some of the dangers of being involved in the occult?
A person can lose his or her mind. There are physical dangers of certainly being used as a sacrifice in an occult satanic ritual. There are the emotional dangers of losing control, of not being able to judge between what is real and what is false. It is an altered state of consciousness. An individual enters into a transcendent sense of reality where it is almost impossible to judge at times what is real and what is false, what is good and what is bad. There is a great danger in occultism so far as the eternal security of an individual is involved. The occult, with its precepts of reincarnation, that is soul evolvement and transmigration, is a deception. It can turn an individual away from the truth of sin and judgment. It can turn an individual away from the truth of heaven or hell. that individual will get the idea that he or she can do anything desirable because the next life can make up for it. Yes, there will be karma to pay, but so what? There is a perspective that greatly varies from Christianity. The idea that he or she can do anything desirable because the next life can make up for it. Yes, there will be karma to pay, but so what? There is a perspective that greatly varies from Christianity. That is a danger, because the Bible claims we have one chance to meet the Savior and to become saved. If we miss that opportunity, if we reject the Son of God, according to Scripture, there is not another chance in the afterlife. There is either heaven or there is hell.
What exactly is witchcraft?
I define witchcraft according to what I believe is the fundamental definition of witchcraft in Scripture. That is, an individual who voluntarily consorts with a demon, or one who possesses a familiar spirit, such as the medium at Endor we read about in the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. The King James Version of the Bible identified her as a witch. We can see very clearly that she consorted with a familiar spirit. When I first met my teacher, she presented herself to me as a beautiful, naked woman, and she was exquisite in every detail, the essence of femininity. She matched my ideals of perfect womanhood at that time. She had a very soft voice, but when she grew angry with me, it could become quite abrasive. She seemed to possess an unearthly wisdom and knowledge. In short, she was everything I wanted to be. The teacher was not a flesh and blood woman. The teacher was a familiar spirit. I worshipped her, or I should say it, idolized it, followed after it as my role model. My relationship with the teacher was very important to me. I needed her favor. I needed her assistance. Without her help, I fell flat on my face. I could not even think without her. She took control of my mind and my will, and I allowed that so that I could get what I wanted.
Is there a difference between white witches and black witches?
There is no difference from the scriptural context. All witchcraft is in Satan's territory. It makes no difference whatsoever whether the witch claims to worship a benevolent god or and goddess, whether the witch claims to practice benevolent deeds for the good of society, whether the witch claims to be a good person doing good things justified by his or her own works. That makes no difference. According to Scripture, the evidence of witchcraft, the identification of witchcraft, falls under the works of darkness, the kingdom of Satan. There is no distinction between good witchcraft and evil witchcraft in Scripture. The witches get very upset when we Christians call them Satan worshippers. And I'm not calling witches Satan worshippers. Not all witches do worship Satan. However, the Bible is clear. The Bible says those things which the Gentiles sacrifice are sacrificed unto demons, indicating that the gods and the goddesses in occultism and witchcraft are demons. Therefore, the witches, whether they want to realize it or not, according to the technology of Scripture, are worshiping the demons that Scripture calls the false gods.
What's the difference between witchcraft and Satanism?
Satanism can be the active worship of Satan. Witchcraft can be distinguished in its various traditions by what god or what goddess is being worshipped. Witchcraft has three basic tenets: reincarnation, cause-effect, and retribution. There are many differences between witchcraft and Satanism. There are differences in objectives, there are differences in codes of conduct, in standards, and there is also a difference in procedure.
That was Mary Harold, an ex-witch, talking about her involvement in the occult. As Mary indicated, there are certainly differences in the various codes of conduct of witches and Satan worshippers, but both groups are responsible to Satan whether they are aware of it or not. Modern Wicca owes much to Gerald Gardner, who lived from 1884 until 1964. He combined the kris, or the magical knife of the Milesian Freemasonry, a pagan goddess, some Western ritual magic, and a belief in reincarnation in his book Witchcraft Today, which was published in 1954. Much of what is considered to be modern witchcraft originated with people who read Gardner's book and requested initiation. As we said before, many people think all of this is a joke. As an illustration of this point, Salem has an official witch right now by the name of Laurie Cabot. While some people may think that Ms. Cabot and her friends are a joke, let me assure you that Ms. Cabot takes herself very seriously. When photographed by a National Geographic photographer, Laurie Cabot and the other witches in her coven produced a blue streak on the photograph that they attributed to their cosmic energy. The photographer said this blue streak was, quote, inexplicable, static electricity, close quote. A blue streak of light is common in many cultic and occultic groups and is believed by many to appear when there is a large amount of demonic activity present. Take a close look at the picture and judge for yourselves. Some witches practice animal and or human sacrifice and are very similar in many ways to those who call themselves Satan worshippers or followers. We also had an opportunity to talk with Mike Warnicki, an ex-witch and Satan worshipper, who told us about his involvement in the occult. We caught up with Mike backstage at an auditorium in South Carolina where he was getting ready to go on stage.
And I had a time in my life where I was going through a real identity crisis, you know, just a real bad problem with knowing who I was or if there was any worth to me or anything like that. And one of the things that I reached out to was the occult, because through being able to do things with the occult and everything like that, I seemed to get something to build kind of an identity around. And I was very popular in high school because I was the one that knew how to do the tarot cards, and I was the one that knew how to do the Ouija board, and I was the one that knew how to do the, you know, the seances and everything. So I was lots of fun at a slumber party. I could scare everybody to death. So, you know, that's how I got involved. I always say that there's only two kinds of spiritual food you can eat. And, of course, there's angel's food and there's devil's food. And if you're not eating angel's food, then you're eating devil's food. And Satan is smart enough that when he begins to feed you on a diet of devil's food, that he doesn't start out with a devil's food cake, simply because he knows that the majority of people would choke on something that big and that rich. So he starts out with just a little bit of something, just whatever it takes to get your attention. And then he drags you further and further into the whole thing. And with me, it was just a desire to have an identity, to be somebody, and to, you know, have something that everybody liked about me.
What is a coven?
A coven is a group of people that gather together to worship. You could say a coven is like an occult congregation. So the difference between, well, nowadays it's not so much practiced this way as it used to be, but it used to be that the traditional number for a coven was only 13 people, being that 13 was supposedly the unlucky number and all of that stuff. But anyway, nowadays, they gather together in a lot larger groups. Modern Satanists are a lot less traditional, a lot less prone to follow the rules exactly. And in most cases, where people are practicing witchcraft and the occult, you'll find them practicing an amalgamation of things. They're not just disciples of, say, Anton LaVey, or just disciples of Aleister Crowley, or just disciples of Helen Blavatsky, or just members of the Process Church or something like that, but they are actually, they actually glean from a lot of different areas and kind of mix up their own stew, so to speak. But a coven is basically a group of people that gather together to worship.
What is a master counselor?
Well, in our group, a master counselor would have been, there are 3 master counselors in our area. And the master counselors are 3 guys. One was in charge of finance, one was in charge of organization, and one was in charge of ritual. And in my case, I was in charge of ritual. And that was for the group that I belonged to. And it was me that decided what color robes we wore, and it's what configuration we stood in. I was the one that studied all the old books and learned how to draw the pentagrams with the right Latin words around the outside circles, and not making sure that all of the lines were closed so that the boogies that we called up didn't get us. And in charge of staging, so to speak. So that a master counselor in our group was the leader, and there were 3 different areas to lead in, and I was the choreographer, I guess you could say.
What changes came over you when you became a master counselor?
The changes that came over me was, I guess, the access to drugs and things that I had in that position was really my downfall, because I was really heavily involved in drugs. And let me say that everybody that's involved in the occult doesn't do drugs. As a matter of fact, a lot of people who are in the occult don't do drugs. But I was very heavily involved with drugs, and becoming a leader and becoming an object of respect and almost worship for some people. Because I got an old 3-inch scar on my wrist here, where my friends used to cut my arm open on the 4 seasons, in the 4 seasons of the year, in the 4 high holidays of the year, and bleed my blood into a cup and mix it with wine and certain spices, including, henbane and stuff like that, to drink as a communion drink on high holidays. And so I had that kind of respect. I had that kind of adulation, almost worship. And because of it, I had access to a lot of dope, a lot of booze, a lot of chicks, and stuff like that. And I've never been one that's been very, very strong in the flesh. It wasn't until Jesus came into my life that I really got any kind of victories in that way. And I just began to overindulge. I mean, overindulge in drugs, overindulge in sex, overindulge in everything. And that really was what led to my downfall, because I got so screwed up behind all of that even the devil didn't want to hang around with me. When you've been so bad the devil didn't want to hang around with you, you've been pretty bad, because, the guy, I think he was afraid I'd ruin his reputation. So, that's the changes that came over me. The chance to have that much power over other people was narcotic to me, and ruined me, just blew me away. Which, in a way, I'm glad, because if it hadn't been for all that happening, I don't think I would have ever turned to the Lord. And I'm certainly glad that I did that. Of course, I've been a Christian 18 years now, a lot longer than I ever was a Satanist. And I really, appreciate the Lord for, sticking with me all that time, and, not being there when I called on him. That was the important thing.
Could you explain the significance of Halloween for us?
Halloween is probably the most sacred of all of the witchcraft holidays, especially in regards to the witchcraft that's practiced in this country. The witchcraft that's practiced in this country, and the Satanism to go back to the Middle Ages and before. Witchcraft goes clear back to the time of the Druids in England, and Satanism goes back to the practice of Satanism basically as it was practiced in the Middle Ages. And the witchcraft holiday and the satanic holiday are the same in the Halloween area. This is a time called Samhain, or All Hallows, and it's a time to worship the God of the dead. And it's a time when graves are opened up and the spirits of the dead are allowed to rise from the graves and visit people who are on earth. It's a time when witches and warlocks and wizards could draw power from these dead people who were let out at this time of the year. This is the belief of the Druids and the Celtic peoples. And it's become a holiday now for people who are involved in the occult to reach to the power of Satan, to reach to the power of death, to reach to the power of dying, and to gain strength from that. Because that's why they practice human sacrifices, because supposedly when someone is killed, there's a lot of cosmic energy released when somebody's killed, and if it's done ritualistic, then those who do it can soak up that energy, from being there and being part of it. They soak up that energy, and that makes them more powerful. And that's why sacrifice is done, that, and to also give a gift to Satan. I mean, that's their thinking. I don't think that way, of course. But when you're dealing with these people, you got to think the way they think, because they're going to react the way they think, not the way you think. So that's the thinking, and that's some of where Halloween comes from. I don't believe that Christians should be involved in Halloween. I know that there are a lot of other holidays that we have, too, that have pagan roots, but, I figure if you can save a person, you can save a holiday, too. So I'm not really worried so much about that, like Christmas and Easter and stuff. But when it comes to Halloween, Halloween is the only holiday that has saved all of its old-time flavor. The jack-o'-lanterns go clear back to a time when warlocks and wizards and witches would roam around town on the night of Halloween and carry these jack-o'-lanterns. And these were to represent the faces of demons and the power that they had. And if people didn't put things out on the doorstep to appease these people, then, you know, their wells could be poisoned, their animals could be killed. And that's where trick-or-treat comes from. You either treat the witches and wizards and what have you, or you get tricked, which means that, you know, your whole livelihood could be wiped out, your house could be burned, your barn could be torched. And so that's where that custom comes from. And the Halloween, the mask, is supposedly the face of a demon smiling at the misfortune of a family who's been tapped by one of these people. So, see, it all goes back to that same old thing. It hadn't changed a bit. The black cats, the familiar spirits, the cats being considered very powerful animals, being connected with Lucifer, and being able to be possessed by spirits very easily and used as familiars by witches. I mean, the whole deal. So, you know, it's all there, and it's all still there. And that's why I don't think that Christians should be involved in Halloween. I think that they should, if they want to give their kids candy, they can just have a party at church and let everybody dress up like Bible characters and call it a fall party and dunk for apples and have a good time. But you don't have to run around dressed up like witches and devils and Frankensteins and stuff. It's just not good. And besides that, it's scary. And besides that, I mean, it's unsafe to let kids trick-or-treat. Not anymore. I mean, maybe it used to not be, but nowadays it seems like every cuckoo out there takes Halloween as an excuse to stick a razor blade in an apple or poison in a Tylenol. You know, I mean, so the whole thing is just beyond, it's beyond me how parents can allow their children to take part in that kind of stuff, because it's very dangerous.
That was Mike Warnicki, an ex-witch or warlock, giving us inside information on witchcraft. Depending upon where they live, witches can turn their black art into a thriving business. Laurie Cabot, for example, whom we mentioned earlier, belongs to the Salem Chamber of Commerce and sells some hardcore witchcraft and Satanism books and objects in her shop. She also teaches beginning, intermediate, and advanced witchcraft classes at a local college, paid for by state funds. She gets paid well for giving lectures, counseling, and casting so-called good spells for corporations. Many witches openly wear large pentagrams, the sign of Satan, with pride. It is a bizarre statement for our society in general and America in particular. According to Infomat, Incorporated, a direct marketing advertising agency with headquarters in Torrance, California, sales of occult-related items increased by 200% in 1980. Products monitored by Infomat include good luck charms, witchcraft books, fantasy games, and other occultic items. Infomat says that the American Astrological Association sold more than 40,000 customized horoscopes in each quarter of 1982 alone. A book called The Magic Power of Witchcraft sold almost 142,000 copies that year. Their report also indicated that more than 70% of occultic sales are to women. Some 30 million people are said to consult their horoscopes regularly, which are now carried by nearly every daily newspaper and by many magazines, including some highly respected women's magazines. However, there's good news. When we talk about the power of Satan, we should never minimize the power of God. Christ said that all power is given to me in heaven and on earth. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all nations. Go, said God to Moses, and my presence will go with you. There is power in the sacrificial blood of Christ. There is power in the gospel, and there is power in the Spirit that lives within the temple of the believer. There is power to touch the evil of the witches, the warlocks, the Satanists, and all the rest. There is power that they fear and power which Christ gave us. Power that masters fear, power that comes to us by the risen Christ. He is declared to be the Son of God with power by resurrection from the dead. When confronted with the power of God, Satan himself will flee. The scripture says, resist the devil, he will flee from you. Jesus said, behold, I give you power over the demons. They are in subjection to you in my name. No force in the universe is equal to the power of a Christian on his knees, trusting in the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus. The task is clear, and the power to do it is ours. The time to do it is now. At the judgment seat of Christ, we must all render an accounting of what we did for the kingdom of God. What will your response be? Think about it. Witches, warlocks, Satanists,